Welcome to this month's Office Hours. So, Office Hours was born out of this idea that, yeah, the podcasts are great, but how do I actually talk to the experts? I want to ask real questions, live questions. And so we thought, well, let's have an Office Hours. Let's invite some of those different types of folks on. We've had IP lawyers. We had Jenny Moshe, who's fantastic. She was talking all things AI, how to put that into your business. And this month, I'm excited. We have some old friends. And I say old friends because I think once you've worked together for 5 years at different companies, you like are old friends. I think that's the definition of it. But Andrew Hosh, the COO of Collinear Group, and Matt Brewster. Matt, I don't even know what title to give you. I'm just going to say all things because if there's a tech problem, Matt can solve it. And so it's a really, really cool topic for conversation today, talking about red flags, how to identify red flags in your development team. So I'm excited to dive into this. There was already a bunch of questions that were given to us ahead of time of folks that were really interested in this topic. So, Anne, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
I have known this crew for a very long time. I think we started about 12 years ago together. Molly and I, 15 years ago together, working in various companies. But I am recruiter, sales, marketer, uh, Jane of all trades, wear many hats, and that's who I am. Matt, why don't you go next?
Yeah, sure. As Molly mentioned, I've played lots and lots of different roles in the tech space over the last, call it 15, 20 years. Out of school, worked more on the QA slash SDET side of the house, dabbled in development for a while, and then spent a good chunk of my career in the DevOps and infrastructure space. And then the last, 4 or 5 years, something like that, really been focused on helping startups and ventures get off the ground and scale and grow. So I really enjoy wearing many, many hats and have lots of experience building software.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, you're next.
Hi, thanks. Yep. As noted, I've known this crew for quite some time over the course of multiple companies. I've lived in Seattle for about 15 years and done just about everything there is to do with software development. I've been a developer, I've done QA, also project manage and all the things, DevOps. Also, I have been a founder of a company, so I know what it's like to be a founder and to go through the startup world, and lived through 2 successful exits in the startup world. So that's a little bit about me.
I like how you say lived through it because I think that's accurate.
Survive.
I've lived through it. Oh my goodness. Well, okay, well, let's kick off. So we're talking about red flags in dev teams. I would love for one of you to kind of give just a quick introduction to that topic. What does that look like?
Sure. Yeah, I'll go ahead. So there's an awful lot of research and metrics and all those kind of things around how to know if your development team is doing well or not doing well. Some people might have heard of Scrum or agile development, which also has a whole bunch of metrics. But the reality is that it's an art, not a science. There's no perfect metric to let you know if your development team is working well or not, particularly if you're not a technical founder. In the dark old days, there used to be this metric called lines of code, and they would count who is writing the most code. And as you can imagine, that's not necessarily a good metric. And then agile development came along, and there's a metric called velocity, which was really similar to lines of code, but how many features are you getting done in a given amount of time? But again, that's not necessarily a good indicator of things. And so the metrics can often create bad behavior. And so Matt and I want to talk a little bit about how the art side of the thing is important, not the science side of the thing. So we're not going to be talking about metrics and all of that today. I think that would be a good kickoff. What do you think,
Yeah,
Matt?
no, I think that's great. Well, what is so I think one of the things that Ann and I hear a lot are, hey, we're building this thing and I am a CEO. I might not have a CTO, right? Or maybe I am functioning as both of those things, and now I need to scale up, and I'm picked somebody maybe offshore. How do I know, what are some things to look at when I'm picking the right dev team, right? How do I know what to look for?
I'll take that one. Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a segue to, I think, our first red flag that we should just hop in and discuss. And so whether your team's, onshore or offshore, at the end of the day, it's really important that, you're shipping features, right? As you all know, development costs a lot of money and a lot of time. And to get a product into the marketplace and be successful with it, it's really important to be faster than your competition, to be frank. And so one of the really easy indicators to look at is, how long is it taking to see, new features, and are they getting into your product and getting to your user base? And the barometer that we typically like to look at is about every 2 weeks. And this isn't, again, a science, but if you're not shipping new code into production about every 2 weeks, that can be a good indication that there's some underlying issues that you might want to go look at.
Okay. Well, and what do you mean, like, missing deadlines? Like, who's setting those deadlines? I think that's another question I have, right? Like, if you don't know what it should look like to develop something, how can you infer like what the timeline should be?
I mean, if you're slow to ship and missing deadlines, there's a lot of reasons underneath, right? So we're just talking about the top level red flag, but I think of the two extremes there. So one reason that you're missing deadlines might be that requirements are not clear. And so you as a founder can do a better job of writing out the requirements or spending more time with the user base and trying to figure out the details of those requirements so that there isn't a lot of questions when the developer is trying to create the feature. So that's one extreme that's easy to fix, right? Then you go all the way over to the other extreme, which is maybe you have the wrong development team, right? Maybe it's a team that claims to be all senior developers, but they're really junior developers, or maybe it's a team that is very unfamiliar with the technology that the application is written in. So there's a lot of reasons why you could be missing, why you're slow to ship and missing deadlines.
Yeah, and even the subspecialties, right? You might have a team that's full of, people that are really, really good on the front end, but, they're being forced to deal with, hairy database queries or something like that on the other end of the stack. And so, oftentimes developers are afraid to speak up too, right? And raise their hand and say, hey, this is outside of my wheelhouse, or I need help. So having that supporting culture, to help unblock people really can help move things along.
Oh, and you guys also use the T-shirt method of, defining how long something will take. And I think sometimes people don't really understand the difference between an extra large and a small. And so that is one of the problems, is sometimes the devs say, I can get this done in 4 hours, and it takes them 10, right? So there's that too, as you're watching your dev team.
Yeah, and that's sort of the other end of, I guess, what Molly was alluding to is, how do you make sure that your estimates are realistic in the first place? And so you can put together this, wonderful project plan, but when, your estimates are wildly off, and you've got a bunch of extra large stories that you've, built small deadlines around, there can be a large mismatch there. So it is really important to help align your expectations with reality up front. It's very easy to say, oh yeah, we got that, we can do all that, we'll be super easy. And then reality deals you a hard dose of of lessons.
Yes.
Well, and I know some of this kind of comes down to transparency, right? So I know that's the second red flag is, if you're not able to see the code or, checking in and understanding what the team is building. Do you guys want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. So, this topic can be a little more technical, but doesn't have to be. So at the end of the day, there's this concept of, continuous integration or continuous delivery. And what that really means is that, as code is being pushed out to, your main branch, it just gets deployed, and you can always go look at the latest state of, you know, whatever it is that your developers are working on. And so as a founder, you don't have to be highly technical and understand all that tooling underneath the hood. But what you should be able to do is every day, you know, go to a URL, you know, if you have a web app, and just simply look and see what the changes are compared to the day before. Go in there and play around with things. And if you're not seeing, you know, changes over time, the flip side to that would be if you need to go to your dev team and ask to see the latest, and then it takes, you know, 2 or 3 days for them to go, you know, do some magic behind the curtain, so to speak, before you get to see the latest. You know, that's a definite red flag. It should be seamless and easy to see what's going on at all times.
Yeah, I'd chime in on that and basically say that there's two things that you should always be able to look at any given time. And one is whatever the newest features are on the application itself, assuming it's to Matt's point, assuming it's a web app of some kind. But however it's deployed, you know, you should be able at any given time go and play around with the app in a test environment. That's one. And then the other is being able to look at the source code, even if you can't read the code or can't understand all the details of the source code. Those are two things that should be changing all the time, and they're two things that you should have access to at any given time. So if it's like 3 in the morning and you have this epiphany about something, you should be able to go to your website and play around with it and then make your notes. If you're in a situation, as Matt says, where you don't really see the code, and to get to see the code is a complicated step. If getting new features out are complicated and take a long time, that just from a deployment point of view, that's also a red flag.
To add to that, you know, there's this concept of what basically amounts to peer review, right? We call it, you know, code review on merge requests on the technical end, but really what that means is that your developers are talking to each other and they're reviewing what, you know, each other are doing. And this all happens, you know, typically in, again, a website you can just go to and see the conversations that your dev team should be having with each other, you know, as their code's being written and merged. And so again, you know, as Andrew said, you don't really need to know how to code or even read the code to just go in there and say, hey, are we having healthy and debate and discussion about how these things are being implemented and you know, going into my product, or is it just you know, quite simply rubber stamp after rubber stamp, nobody ever challenges anything? That would be something you'd want to go look at and say, hey, you know, I don't know that my team is thinking critically or helping to support each other and making the product better as they're going about building it.
Well, how does the team structure play into that, right? So is there a strategist, or what? I don't know the right term, but like, how do you guys set up teams so that you do have that person who's kind of has visibility into the whole thing end to end?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, you need to have a development lead, someone who also codes, to be clear, right? So if you have a development lead who's not coding, or if you have someone, I'm gonna share some bias here. If you have someone who claims to be an architect and doesn't code, those are red flags. I think a dev lead who doesn't, a dev lead who's just a traffic cop, or an architect who likes to design things they don't have to implement, those are danger signs. But yeah, so you have a dev lead who is kind of has the final say on things, from a technical point of view. And to Matt's point, you don't necessarily need to know, you don't need to be able to read code to be able to read comments, right? And so if you look in the code base, and when the developers are pushing their code in to get deployed, if there's no comments whatsoever or no discussion, that's a warning sign. If there is only one word comments like approved, that's another warning sign. That means that no one is really reviewing the code. And so if the developers aren't reviewing each other's code, then lots of bad things happen in production, right? And when bad things happen in production, then the developer's dealing with problems in production and not dealing with creating new features, right? It becomes a spiral.
No, that's good. I was just going to write that down. Beware of architects. So write that down. Nobody with that title. Not
Personal bias.
I love it. No, it's good. Well, and I think all that kind of leads into the next red flag, which we kind of touched on 3, which was the merge request piece, talking to each other, but then just recapping for everyone in the audience to follow along. Number 4, you're talking about redoing things. So those previous red flags almost create that 4th red flag where you have to redo things because you're not talking to each other. And I know Matt has some strong opinions on this, so I wanted to let you take the floor first, Matt, and talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you mentioned is just exactly right. You end up with this flywheel that, is giving you this negative feedback, and you get yourself into these really bad places. And so I like this concept of a redo meter, like, yes, you're gonna have to redo things as you go along and build your product, right? That's a normal part of software development. But if it's happening a lot and your redo meters is getting too high, right? You're spending a lot of time and effort and money doing things that are, not helping further your vision, right? You're just going back and redoing the same thing over and over instead of building and delivering those new features that your user base wants. And so I think that's a really simple and a really powerful thing to look at is, how often are you redoing the same type of functionality? And if it's becoming, increasingly obvious that this is happening again and again, got some things to go look at for sure.
Well, and I feel like I would love to hear a story because you guys do this every day. So you help startups, you focus in on these things, you dive in, maybe when they've gotten started, they're halfway through something or they haven't started at all. What's an example recently where you guys have helped a team, you've come in and you help them address some of these red flags?
I can think of a couple. One, they had the obvious problems, what we'll call table stakes, right? Where they had an application, and if more than 2 or 3 people got on to the application would fall over. The deployment of the application, which was a web app, would take half a day. So a very long time. And without getting into the details of it, the technical details really, but essentially what they had is a very old school approach to the cloud. Effectively, they had I don't know if people remember, but back a long time ago, we used to have these things called servers in server rooms, and essentially they took that concept and just moved it to the cloud. So they had these giant servers, I'll call them, in the cloud, and they were manually copying the code from the source repository and manually copying it into the server. So there's a lot of manual steps, a lot of margins for error, right? A lot of human error can happen when you have lots of manual steps. And then the features were just, very fragile. So things would fall over if you had more than, like I said, 2 or 3 people on it. So we came in and immediately helped with the continuous deployment. We also changed I'm going to use the word architecture. We changed the architecture, the underlying architecture of the
Architect over there.
of the cloud, such that it was using more modern technology and not technology from the early 2000s. That was an interesting project too, in that it turned out that the development team that was working on it was an offshore team, and they had basically cut and pasted from other pieces of parts from other projects into the source code. So it was a lot of amalgams of different old projects, and so it was just quite a mess.
So back to the redo meter, right? So when you get into that sort of situation where, hey, this thing keeps falling over, right? You just start trying to put duct tape on top of duct tape on top of duct tape. You're spending all your time trying to like scale this super old system from 3 people to 5 people or whatever. And meanwhile, your cloud bills just keep going, up and up and up, right? That's like a really good indication that it's time to revisit where you're at and make some structural changes to your project such that you can unstick yourself, right? Rip off the duct tape and move along.
They were just stuck on this one feature, and they couldn't. They had spent like 3 months on the feature, and just couldn't get it fully working. Because at that point, the Jenga tower had so many things pulled out of it that,
It's a good visual.
anytime they tried to add something, it would just fall over.
Yeah, and that kind of leads to the last one that we were going to talk about, which is, how do you, when you're over engineering something or you're building something that, you code from scratch, you're building and it's just taking less than a few days to get features out. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I think there's, a couple different things that we can talk through there. And one is just avoiding building things that you shouldn't be building, right? So sometimes you have, I see it more often with senior developers that have been around the block a time or two, or 200 too many sometimes. And the first inclination will be to go build something yourself instead of pulling something off the shelf, whether it be open source or a service that you can integrate into your product that's going to be more modern, more stable, and oftentimes cheaper, right? So like authentication is a really good example there. If you're out trying to build your own authentication and authorization system, you're probably running down a rabbit hole you don't want to be in. Instead you can just pull one of the myriad of AWS services off the shelf, or Auth0 is another great one that we use quite often to solve that problem for our clients' needs. It's quick, easy, cheap, and well supported. So there's really no reason to go build that yourself, right? And then the other sort of piece that we see pop up on occasion is, this desire to make perfect code, right? There's no such thing as perfect code, and you can spend a very, very long time, as Anne mentioned, trying to over-engineer something to the point that it just never gets shipped, right? It never makes it into the wild, and then ends up being, super, super complex and hard to maintain when, maybe you just needed to solve this one little piece of the puzzle, not the whole thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Code that never ships is code that really has no value. So,
Yeah, that's well said.
Yeah, I mean, as a founder, going back to the building things you shouldn't build. As a founder, how do you know if this is something that needs to be built or not? And the question is, you should ask yourself: is this a problem that's already been solved? Because if it's a problem that's already been solved, you shouldn't be spending a lot of time developing it, right? Like, so things like logging, authentication, authorization, all those, style sheets, those are all problems that have been solved a long time ago, right? So you want the dev team to be focused on your magic beans, right? Whatever they are. The important parts of your application, the unique parts of your application, and not focused on the problems that have already been solved. So yeah, again, just a couple of months ago, we came in on a project, and the lead developer had been working on his own from scratch authorization and authentication system for, I think it was like 6 weeks or something like that. And he was on week 7 when we came in. And, there was nothing special. There were no magic beans for that app in terms of authentication, or, they just needed users to be able to log in and then see the web page. And so it was really a lot of lost time and wasted time when they could have been, getting new features deployed.
No, that's a good example. And I mean, I know that you guys do this a lot, and I also want to make sure we save time for questions. And I've already gotten a couple, but I would love to hear, okay, what are some things off the top that I should not build? You named a few. So, but like to your point, like, can you just list a couple for the founders in the audience? Like, these are things you should definitely not build from scratch yourself.
I was going to say, authentication, authorization, we already touched on. Logging is another one, right? It's really easy to go, well, not really easy, but can be really time consuming to go build an elaborate logging system. And you really should be pulling, existing tools and libraries off the shelf to go build those. Now, I will say, even with those, logging can become, quite complex in certain applications. But if you're starting out, that should be something that's quick and easy.
There's a famous example. This is Microsoft Azure, I believe it was. instead of using just an off-the-shelf library that managed, date and time and things like that, for some reason, they created their own.
Hmm.
And that hand-created date and time library didn't take into account leap year. And so I don't remember the exact details.
Uh-oh.
Basically, all of their certificates that were used for services to talk to each other internally were based off of this library. And then, leap day came and went, and suddenly everything broke.
Oh, no. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Well, I have a couple questions in the chat, so I want to dive into that because it is office hours. So, I everyone's talking about AI and everyone's talking about vibe coding. I would like to understand, and this question is talking about the human in the loop. So, as a startup founder, why would I build something, or partner with a team to build something when I could potentially use AI for it? And I think you guys have thoughts on that, so I want to get your answer.
Yeah, let's see where to start with this one. So, uh, AI is really great if you want to just spin up a quick prototype, right? Like you as a founder with some technical chops can totally start to coalesce on your ideas and push something out and get quite a long ways, just using AI. In fact, I can code, but I'm certainly not a coder by trade, but I did just build a proof of concept um, AI chatbot that mined Jira data and allows you to ask project manager like questions uh, to the chatbot, and produce some fairly insightful results, right? And I used ChatGPT primarily to code most of that up, and it did a really good job getting me quite a long ways. So I think it's a really powerful tool, especially for that first like ideation phase and like making something that is starting to be real, right? But once you try and scale past that, right, to the point where you need a team of people working on something, I'm not going to say AI is not still very helpful, but the usage of it changes quite a lot, right? You've got a code base that might already exist now, and you need to understand how different parts of the system uh, work together, and that's where really smart developers come into play that are able to leverage AI tool sets in their everyday job to be very efficient and fast at what they're doing, but you don't know how to ask the right questions or integrate that into your workflow when you're working on those uh, larger projects. You can again run down rabbit holes that you don't want to end up in. So that would be my premise to that. I'm sure Andrew's got more on that.
Yeah, I mean, I concur. You know, how we do things has changed significantly in the last 18 months, I'll say. In the old, particularly around like trying to determine market fit, right? So if in the olden days of 18 months ago, if we wanted to determine market fit, we would we'd find a UI UX developer or a designer, and then they might create a whole bunch of mock-ups, and then you cut and paste those mock-ups onto a PowerPoint, and then go shop around your PowerPoint to potential users right before you start building the thing, and try to make sure you don't want to like go out and rush out and develop, right? You want to design it first, and then get some market validation and some input before you actually invest in building the thing. But now we actually just build the thing. And is it production ready? No. Is it going to scale? No. Is it all throwaway? Yes. But it's just much more interactive, right? To like, hey, here's a website. It's just a proof of concept or just a prototype, but go in there and play around with it. That's much more exciting and a lot better feedback. You'll receive a lot better feedback with that than with a static PowerPoint slide or a static set of UX designs.
Yeah, being able to get your hands on something and play around with it is just really powerful at the end of the day, and it'll elicit a lot more feedback from your potential users as well. That then you can go turn the crank on and put together that feature list that you need to go build for a real MVP. So yeah, that prototyping phase, it can be very, very powerful.
Well, we had a question. I see you, Ramsey. Thank you for putting a question in the chat. I appreciate that. He's very active in the community too. So if anybody wants to reach out to him, you can. Kind of a question around cloud cost optimization. If you want to clarify your question a little bit too, Ramsey, that might be helpful. But I know that Collinear Group offers, different types of packages. And I know that there's things, kind of that you do around the cloud and what that looks like. And I don't know if you want to maybe talk about that a little bit, how you can help founders in that capacity.
So, we mentioned this earlier in one of the red flags, right? We'll see, folks come to us and say, hey, my AWS bill is like super expensive and I don't really understand why or what's going on, right? It's really easy to, click the right or wrong buttons depending on whether you're AWS or the founder that, can let your costs go wildly out of control. And so we do offer, just a very short engagement, consulting service to come in and just kind of get the lay of the land, what you have deployed, what you're trying to do, and see, where that is or isn't meeting, the actual needs of your application. We can help fine tune things to wrangle that spend back in.
Just on Friday, we had a client reach out to us, and they had a whole new project where they wanted to move a whole bunch of AWS data from AWS and into their Google Drive. And they're like, well, we've got just gigabytes and gigabytes of data out there, and it must be costing us a fortune. And so they create this whole new project, and we're going to, do this big migration. But when they actually asked us the question, we're like, well, actually, you're just paying pennies on the dollar. Pennies a month probably storing that, because it was all stored properly in an S3 bucket, to be a little technical, and had a full life cycle. And they were going to spend more money paying people to move the data than to just leave the data there for the next 10 years.
That's good. I like that. We have a question. Let me read it. Starting out as a founder, building an application, what type of security measures would you recommend to get started with? Much like the things you recommended that I don't have to build from scratch. So what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, there's some, the good news is that just doing the basics is going to get you 90% of the way there, right? So all the esoteric, off the wall things that you read about in the news is probably like the 10% that you generally don't have to worry about. So, I mean, from a security point of view, you should have, as we mentioned before, you should have authorization and authentication. And there's services out there that provide that for you, so you don't have to create them. You should ensure that if it's a web app, that it's encrypted, so it's has HTTPS in front of it and not HTTP. And again, there's open source free auto certification systems out there now. You don't have to pay GoDaddy $80 for a certificate anymore. And then
New world.
yeah, and then if you're in the cloud, right, just follow, and this is a generic, but just follow the best practices. So you don't want your database on the internet, for example. So only put things on the internet that need to be on the internet. And generally, that's just your front end piece of application.
I'll add just a little bit more. So, as you start scaling up your user base, it's also really important to at least have some basic logging and monitoring in place, such that and alerting, right? Such that that something is starting to go awry. A common thing that I've seen is you push out a public API, right, for others to use your data or underlying system, but you don't put in the right rate limiting measures, and so a bad actor will start trying to exploit your application. And while they might not actually get to any of the data, again, back to the AWS cost optimization thing, depending on how you're set up, it'll readily scale quite high and burn many, many dollars very quickly. if you don't have things configured properly. So really important to have, the monitoring and alerting in place as you push your ideas out to the world, because there are unfortunately plenty of bad actors out there just trying to cause trouble.
No, that's helpful. I have one more question here I want to make sure we get to before I'm going to read it. That's kind of jumbled a little bit, but if I'm interpreting this incorrectly, please retype it or chime in with some clarification. But it sounds like I'm looking for, what should my timeline look like from idea to MVP? And how do you work with startups to do that? I think is how I'm interpreting that question. If I'm wrong, chime in, type again, and I'll reiterate it. But
It should be fast. So
okay.
so and fast means like we talked about, right? Nowadays you can get a prototype up, and that's a very specific term, right? Prototype meaning something that it's not necessarily going to scale and not something you'd want to live with long term. I mean, 4 to 6 weeks is kind of a rule of thumb. I mean,
Okay.
your mileage may vary, right? If you've got something very complicated to put out into the world, I mean, it might take longer, and if it's not very complicated, it might take much less. But yeah, and then like we talked at the beginning, 2-week cadence or less, right? More frequent than 2 weeks should be your feature rollouts. So you should, some large projects are rolling out multiple features a day, right? But
how big of a team do you need for that? Or is that just like one person doing that? That sounds daunting. Multiple features a day.
Yeah, it's probably not going to be one person if you're doing that.
Okay. All right. So like, what does that look like for a startup? Like, is that like, that's where you partner with, say, like someone like Collinear Group, and they have like a whole team they just drop in and they do that, or what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, it depends a lot on what your goals are, right? And I think there's sort of two sides to this story, and one is that you need to match your scope to some, the minimal thing that you can get out the door to validate the market. We see, quite often founders will, have a huge vision, which is great. But if you spend, a year trying to build that vision before you have validated the market, you can end up in trouble, right? You might build this wonderful thing that nobody wants to use.
Right.
And so helping to, scope that first piece that you can push out the door, hopefully in a couple months, just to start to validate, even if it's only on, 1 or 2 very friendly users, right? That's still very impactful and can be hugely powerful, as opposed to, waiting a long time, building a lot with a very big team. Back to your question about, Linear specifically, yeah, we have lots of levers to pull, right? We can help you get started with a very small team, again, to not spend a lot of money, try and get something out there into the wild. And then as you start to gain traction, we can bring in more resources to help scale that up as, your funding allows.
Okay. I think that answered that question. And there's one more follow on. They said, what kind of budget? I'm going for a raise. What should my ask be of the VCs or the funders if I'm looking to bring in a software team?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, if you're in pre-seed land, there's many answers to that. But generally, seed rounds now are like $1 or $2 million is what I'm seeing. But pre-seed, I mean, it could be 25K, it could be 50K, it could be 100K. Kind of depends on the complexity of what you're trying to do.
Okay. And all of that is allocated to the dev team, or is that like, how much should someone expect to kind of allocate to the tech piece of it?
I mean, early on, it's going to be majority of it, right?
Okay.
Certainly, when you're trying to do market fit and getting something out there, you're probably looking at 75 or 80% of your spend is going to be on the development. But a lot of companies need to pivot though pretty quickly, right? So if you're not going to fail because of the technology, because you've got a good team and there's no red flags, then the very next thing is marketing and sales, right?
Yeah.
And so I have personally watched in real time companies that executed perfectly on the technical and then needed to pivot into what was very much a marketing play. So there was one startup where everything depended on network effects, right? It was trying to build a community, and the community needed to be very large for this to even get a little bit of traction, and they basically didn't account for that, and had to close up shop. So they executed well on the technology, great tech, nice looking web page, but then and web app, I should say, but they didn't execute on getting the community together, and certainly didn't have the funding for it.
Okay. Well, and I know, Anne, you've dealt with some of this too. I wanted to, and just to tie in, and we'll wrap it up here in a moment, but just the idea of, okay, if you're going to investors, what's some of the language that you should use if you're going to bring in a team that's outside of your own, right? I know you've dealt with that, so I wanted to see what you thought.
I think one of the things about bringing in an outside team is that some investors have a real problem that the intellectual property is not held by the founders. And we have run into this a number of times. And what we have found is that they don't understand that we or other consultants work for hire. And so the intellectual property, they just need to make sure that the intellectual property remains with the company that's bringing the consultants in. And as long as that language is clear, it can be a very good option for startups to use an outside service to build their products. Did I state that right, guys? That's kind of
I was just going to add on that, it takes a long time to build a high performing dev team, right? And it's also very expensive. So, and you especially know on the recruiting side of the house, right? You said, hey, I want to start today and I need a high performing dev team of, 3 to 5 people. You might say, okay, well, buckle up. This is going to take, a few months at least to go recruit for, right? And so it is pretty powerful to be able to, pull that dev team, off the shelf, so to speak, and start building your product on day one, assuming you've got enough funding for, a few months of runway, right? So you can go get something built and deployed. And that's, the type of work we love to do. It's a lot of fun to come in and help make, vision reality. And we're really well tooled to do that.
Yeah, that's well said. Well, for the sake of time, because we're 45 minutes office hours, I try to keep to that. Is there anything that you want to end with? Either one of you, just kind of like you're speaking to founders, they're building something, it's hard. Talk about what you've done, Collinear Group. Any last thoughts?
For me, I would say, just to kind of wrap, we talked all the negatives, here's the things to look for, but really it kind of boils down to spending a little bit of time every day on your application, like be on it and play around with it and look at every release, and when you can, look at the source code, and at least the comments in the source code or around the source code. Those are things that will help you go a very long way versus like just blindly trusting some development team to execute.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's your baby, right? So you want to make sure you're raising it appropriately, and make sure you see all the milestones.
Oh, I love that, Matt. That's so poetic. That's such a good ending.
It is a good ending. And it's so true. And it should be fun. It should be, a lot more fun than it is misery while you're trying to get all of this done. It should be exciting. And so it is. It's exactly like watching your kid go through all the milestones. So.
Yep. But they still are going to scream at 3 o'clock in the morning on occasion.
Absolutely, they are.
I love that. Well, okay. Thank you guys very much. I appreciate everybody for attending and for you guys taking your time out of your busy days to kind of chat through some of the red flags and other things. So thank you very much.